What's up, YouTube? At the time of recording this, it's like 6 a.m. So if you notice a little bit of sun, I tried to tilt the camera down a bit so that wouldn't be too much in the way. But if it is, I apologize. You can yell at me in the comments down below, help out the algorithm, whatever. Anyway, we've got a donation request here. So we're going to be running through this league. This is a League of Dimir Shadow that a viewer wanted me to play. They wanted to essentially sponsor a league. So we did that. Some of the things that they really wanted to know out of this list is like, is Street Wraith really worth it? So instead of running 4 Street Wraith, we've subbed in 2 copies of Shieldred's Edict. We've got a 20th land, a second copy of Dress Down. The rest of the core of the deck, pretty similar. The 4 Murktide, 4 Shadow, Brazen Borrower. We've got 4 Counterspell, 3 Drown in the Lock, 4 Archmage's Charms, 4 Consider, 4 Fatal Push, 4 Thoughtseize, couple Dismember. Like I said, the 2 Shieldred's Edicts, 2 Stubborn Denial. In the sideboard, got a Flusterstorm with a couple copies of Minor Misstep, a Dress Down, 2 Spreading Seas, 2 Mystical Dispute, a Subtlety, a Dismember, a Turok, 2 Engineered Explosives, and 2 Unlicensed Hearses. Why this looks so terrible. We'll see if this, yeah, it kind of clears up. Never mind, we're good. Just that one awkward pause spot. But let's get going with the league. So this is going into round number 1. Lose the die roll. Hand's okay. Like, we're really bad against the turn 1 Ragavan, but if they don't have a turn 1 Ragavan, then we do get to our counter magic. Looks like opponent's on Living End. Turn 1 Grief takes our Thoughtseize, so we're just kind of hoping that Soft Stubborn Denial on turn 2 will stop a potential Cascade spell on their side. And then after turn 2, hopefully we can untap with Archmage's Charm and stop it that way. We find a threat, but we don't quite have the life total low enough to get it down. And with opponent playing out their 4th land here, they're going to be able to play around Soft Stubborn Denial should they choose. So we just have to hope that they don't have Force of Negation. And, yep. Oh well, we tried. The joy of having like 3 mana and mana-dependent counter spells against Living End. Fortunately, even if we had like a Spell Pierce over Stub or something, like we were still getting countered by Force of Negation. So not a lot left on the table there. We'll just see what we draw. Nothing. All right, let's scoop and go to game 2. Modern. So sideboarding against Living End, basically boarding out a bunch of like Fatal Pushes, Dismember, stuff like that. Bringing in any extra copies of Flusterstorm, Minor Misstep, Mystical Dispute to fight over Force of Negations. And we're just keeping a hand with like every counter spell we can find. Just anything that'll help us interact over some of these Cascade spells. I don't want a Death Shadow right now. Like, we're a ways away from our life total being low enough to cast that. So it's kind of just like a dead piece of cardboard. I'd rather find more lands, more counter spells, and then eventually a little bit later find a threat. But we do get to Thoughtseize. We see the Shardless Agent and the Curator of Mysteries. Take the Shardless. Hope they don't cascade into anything relevant too quickly. And then the goal here is to not tap off of 2 mana ever for like the rest of the game. So you'll see us kind of just chill for pretty good while. Because even after we get to a point where we can hold up like double counter spell, we're still not safe because of Cascade Spell plus Force Negation or Cascade Spell plus Mystical Dispute. So the only reason I'm going for like this Dress Down here is because they've tapped down to 3 mana, which means they can't have Force Negation or Mystical Dispute on their turn. So I know I'm going to get to untap again with 4 mana. But like, I'm not playing out the Shadow here because I've got a counter spell and a soft stub soft stub doesn't matter once they've hit this 5 mana point. So I'm not playing this shadow until I've got Stubborn Denial online. And even then, I'm kind of running the risk of, okay, what if I put Shadow on the stack and they respond with a Cascade spell? Or worse, they respond with double Cascade spell. So now, as you can see, I had the Fiery Islet to get Stubborn Denial online. I'm not paying for this Mystical Dispute. I'm not countering back because I don't want to use up a bunch of counters on this. Like, the Shadow resolving is not that important. Them not resolving a living end, far more important. But we're just kind of in a holding period. Let me talk about why I do cast this Consider. So my opponent's at 6 mana. They have plenty to do any sort of instant speed shenanigans that they want. But because it's on their turn, they can't force a negation for free. So if I go for a Consider and they respond with a Cascade spell and I respond with a counter spell, and they either go for a hard cast force negation or a mystical dispute, I can mystical dispute theirs. And I guess we can't if they have exactly mystical dispute, but if they have Cascade spell of hard cast force negation, I can fight over that. So we're just kind of like hoping that they don't have the absolute nuts because I've got to get something going. But yeah, just quick 2 cents there. And then again, like not playing Hearse here because I do not have the mana to back it up. I need to be able to like fight over something and fight over their ability to fight back. Which is why you won't even see me play this Murktide until I have like double counter up backing it up. All right. So now we've got Murktide double counter. So I can play out a pretty chunky Murktide, make it a 2-turn clock. I've got double counter spell backup. Opponent does have a Violent Outburst, so we'll go ahead and use up this Stubborn Denial while we can. Usually, if you can afford to, counter spells are kind of most effective if you use them in order from most specific to least specific. So, for example, using Stubborn Denial there because it counters non-creature spells. So the only targets are going to be like Living End or a Force of Negation. And then we'll work down to like Mystical Dispute because it counters their counter spells as well as like the blue creatures out of their deck. But it doesn't hit Living End itself. And then we'll work down from that to actual counter spell that can just hit whatever we need to hit at that moment. So we're just hoping that having triple counter spell available will get us there. Luckily, it does. So we get to go to game number 3. No real changes in the sideboard. Little bit dicey on the draw with a 1-lander, but we do have a Thoughtseize, a Consider. We had a minor misstep. We found a second land. Opponent's hand's pretty subpar, just a few cyclers and a Shardless Agent. But Living End, when all of your cards just say like 1 mana, draw a card, eventually you're going to find the stuff that you need. So it's not really a surprise that they find everything. Again, fine tapping off a counter spell there because my opponent can't have a Cascade spell with only 2 mana. Shout out to Simian Spirit Guide getting banned. Consider because they only have 3 mana up, so I know they can't Cascade spell plus Force of Negation or Mystical Dispute on their turn. Now, since they're going to go for the hard cast Mystical Dispute, I will Mystical Dispute that back, so I've got a counterspell on their turn. They've used up everything I know about, so I'm just kind of hoping that they don't have a Cascade spell plus a counterspell on their turn. This is like my shields down turn. Like, hey, you got this one opportunity, and then I'm never tapping off of double counterspell again. So just doesn't matter if I'm drawing like hearses or whatever. I am not tapping off double counter spell. Like opponent finds Odawara, cool. One shadow. I don't care if double shadow is lethal next turn. I am not tapping off of double counter spell. And we get there. So opponent ended up scooping up here. We'll take it. On to match number 2. So match number 2 on the draw again. Hands reasonable. Obviously lucky that they didn't have a Ragavan. So many hands we see are like exponentially worse if our opponent's got Ragavan. So they've got a couple coming to play tapped artifact lands, a Spyro, and a Gleeful Demolition. We take the Demolition so that they can't go wide, so immediately they top deck another Demolition. And we have to take the Spyro, and now we're just kind of like they kind of hit the perfect curve out with these coming to play tapped lands. Being able to hit the Gleeful Demolition on turn 1, hit us with the Thoughtseize bug, and then immediately follow it up with the Dash Ragavan that we kind of have to dismember. Like, I could have taken the Ragavan hit and saved 2 life, but at the same time, like, then they're just dashing Ragavan again next turn, and that saving 2 life is kind of moot. All right. So sideboarding against mono red. Let's go over that real quick. Just boarded out like a dismember, boarded out a couple Thoughtseizes because my life total is going to be a little bit in jeopardy. Boarded in the minor missteps and the engineered explosives. So 2 minor missteps, 1 EE for the 2 copies of Thoughtseize and 1 copy of Dismember. Just try to be a little more interactive on the early turns. Got like minor misstep for a Ragavan or Darcy if I want. End up deciding to fatal push the Darcy, hold the minor misstep for like a Ragavan or something, or a Gleeful Demolition. But it looks like opponent's just going to miss their second land drop. So we will gladly take the opportunity to just like set up our hand here, draw some cards, find some stuff. We get to keep hitting land drops. We get more Archmage's Charms to draw more. We've got Counterspell held up for anything crazy. I don't want to be too aggressive with my life total because I do still have like these Thoughtseizes and stuff in my deck. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to go too crazy. But eventually I do find a Murktide, get down to 8/8 Murktide. I've got it backed up with minor misstep. All right, so this is game 3. We are on the draw. We do have a misstep for a 1-drop. Hopefully it's not like Dash or Ragavan here. I decided to go ahead and misstep this Dragon's Rage Channeler more because like they have so many come into play tap lands that I'm just kind of hoping that they stumble here. And it looks like they did, so I get to untap with Counterspell. Maybe snag like a Spyro, but it's just a Cleansing Wildfire. We'll go ahead and sub that because Cleansing Wildfire is like ramp a land and draw a card. So it's a reasonable amount of value, and I kind of get to go ahead and utilize that Stubborn Denial. I do have the follow-up Demolition here. Thankfully, like if they do attack in, it means we get our Shadow online. I do want to point out that like this is the kind of spot that I feel most people really dislike Street Wraith. And usually that comes from like, hey, my life total's too low. I think I'm fetching and shocking and like cycling Wraith too aggressively. And if you don't have Shadow, you just like don't need to do all that. You can be conservative with your life total and see. I also think this was a mistake on my part. I should have just played out both shadows, but I ended up just playing out one because I was like, oh, I want to save this fetch land. I don't want to fetch and shock real aggressively. Uh, I want to save it in case they go for like attack or bolt my shadow, whatever I can fetch. I should have just played out the second shadow and just gone like really hard on the front foot. So they've got Hellraiser, which does hit Boom Bust, but I've got Counterspell for that. And then I've got Shieldred's Edict to wipe away the Hellraiser. I was kind of thinking, like, I don't care that much about the Hellraiser. They got a bunch of whiffs. So I'll let them have that. And I'll just, like, wait and see what they hit. Because if they just hit, like, Baubles and Cleansing Wildfire, then sure, whatever. And then I also should have countered this Spyro. I was thinking I really wanted to kill the Ragavan, but I don't think the Ragavan really mattered because, like, they could dash, but they couldn't do a ton of damage to me here. Um, and then I would have Otawara. Maybe they didn't attack correctly, and I could, like, Otawara blocker and have lethal on the crackback or something like that. But because they had, I honestly just didn't think they had two spells in hand to ditch to Spyro, and I should have played around that a bit. So unfortunately, our opponent's got Spyro tokens here to block. Couldn't find an EE. But yeah, those two spots, the not countering the Spyro and the not playing out the second shadow, I really think came back to bite me there. It's a really important thing to recognize when you need to, like, turn the corner with a deck like Dimir. So all right, we're on the play game 3. Thoughtseize. We see that our opponent's got a couple Castle Embreth with a Goblin Grenade, Reckless Bushwhacker, and then just like a bunch of cheap artifacts and things that don't matter too much. We get our Shadow down. I'm really hoping that my opponent puts a creature on the battlefield. I'm actually really surprised that they didn't, because, like, wanting a blocker, especially just a Memnite, seems really good. But I was hoping that they would play out a Memnite so I could dismember, hold priority, dismember again on the same Memnite, lose 8 life, and just make my shadow attack lethal. But they ended up not playing out the Memnite, but I just drew a dress down, so you know we'll take that. Go into game 2. Very similar to the last matchup, boarding out like some Thoughtseizes. I decided to keep a Dismember in because they were a little more creature heavy and less token oriented. Boarding in like the Engineered Explosives, boarding in Minor Missteps. So very, very, very similar. I was going to crack in with a Voldaren Epicure. We say cool. Get my Consider on. I'm fine drawing more lands here because that does mean I get to EE. I get to hold up counter magic. Get to get down a shadow next turn and hold up counter magic. No reason to shock here. It's like my opponent's probably going to end up attacking me. This, I've pointed it out in previous videos. I love so much when my opponent refuses to get in like a chip attack. And I have explicitly stated it in videos before. So if you're watching this and you're not like a huge Shadow player, if you play other decks and you're playing against Shadow, and your opponent's sitting in like that 13, 14, 15 life total range or whatever, attack. There is, people always say, oh, I don't want to enable Shadow. I don't want to grow Shadow. Your opponent, your Shadow opponent, their entire deck is built around the idea of getting down below 13 life to get Death Shadow online. I promise you, 9 times out of 10, if you don't make that attack, they still have a way of getting Death Shadow online. Like, there's such a low likelihood that you're stopping them from getting shadows on the battlefield or whatever. So just make the chip attack. Just get in the damage because like that matters. Like here, I'll just EE take the 3-for-1. They end up seeing a Coldotha Rebirth off of the experimental synthesizer, but since they have to play it before the end of my turn, they don't get access to it. But that means I get to just like draw some cards. They fire off a shrapnel blast here. You got it. That is like you skipped out on the chip attack and then you're shrapnel blasting me. So I feel like you'd be better served just taking the chip attack. Now all of a sudden I'm down to 6 damage. I'm like a double bolt away from dying instead of double bolt and an attack from a creature you don't have. So yeah, just take the damage. But we're just gonna hold up our counter spells. I don't think there's really a reason to be too aggressive and get another threat down when I can just wait till next turn, get a threat, and hold up more counter magic. So kind of like this, get my attack in for 6, play the shadow, because now if I fetch to have my second counter spell up, then I've got 2 lethal or a pair of attackers that are lethal. On to match number 4. On the draw, Ragavan's unfortunate, but thankfully we do have one of the fatal pushes here. Since they let on Sunbaked Canyon instead of like a Fiery Islet, I decided to hold the fatal push until their combat. If they had let on a Fiery Islet, I would kill it on my turn to play around like Spell Pierce or Counterspell, something like that. If they had played a Black Source, like a Black Cleave Cliffs or a Blood Crypt, I also would have killed it on my turn to play around an Undying Evil effect. But because it was Sunbaked Canyon, I waited till their turn. They could have Ephemerate, but they didn't reveal like an Obosh, so I don't think they're on Ephemerate. Either way, we thought sees them. The Boros Charm, Seasoned Pyromancer, Gideon of the Trials, and Blasphemous Act. So I have no idea what I'm up against. My only guess is some sort of like Boros pseudo value kind of pile something with cards I felt like playing. They got like the cool arts, but really no clue what I'm up against. Like Blasphemous Act has thrown me so much for a loop. We do take Gideon because if like Gideon gets down and under a counter spell here and just completely blanks my Murktide, like I got nothing. I can beat a Spyro. I don't think I can beat Gideon of the Trials just like indefinitely blanking my Murktide. So take the Gideon, hoping that our opponent just like misses their third land drop. They don't, but instead of going for the Spyro, they just go for a main deck Boros Charm. So that's making me think this is some sort of like burn deck. Just like a few awkward card choices. But now I get to dress down a Spyro, which is huge for me. Because I'm going to be able to like consider here and then just untap and get a Murktide down. Shock down to 5 so I can hold up the Drown in the Lock as well. Vexing Devil was not on my radar, but at least I know if I go for the Shieldred's Edict here, I'm not dead to another Boros Charm. We'll just hang back for a turn, see what our opponent does. Archmage's Charm that, so if I find like a fetch land or something, I can get down Murktide and hold up Drown in the Lock. But instead, we just find a Fatal Push, so I can Fatal Push the Vexing Devil and have Drown in the Lock for another play, like so. Also has the benefit of putting extra cards in my yard, instants and sorceries, so that I can play out this second Murktide, grow the first Murktide, and have a lethal attack in, and just hope that they don't have another Path to Exile. That would kind of suck, right? So really goes to show the power of like holding up counter spells instead of just jamming a lot of the time, which is what this Dimir deck really specializes in, is like saying, hey, I've got a lot of interaction. I don't need to force down my threats. Like, be patient, get your opening. Because if we had gone for the Murktide first or something and they just like pathed our original Murktide, then we just give them like 3 extra turns we didn't need to give them. Sideboarding. I boarded in the minor missteps because I saw like Ragavan and Bolt and Path and stuff. Boarded out a Dismember and a couple Thought Seizes, and then boarded in the Flusterstorm. So I just figure like, hey, this is a value mid-range pile, and I've seen Blasphemous Act and Path and Boros Charm, Lightning Helix. Thankfully, game one, our opponent did not see Death Shadow. So they do lead off on just like a lightning bolt here, and as soon as we fetch, they go for another burn spell. So I'm like, cool, there's a reasonable chance I'm just going to get down double shadow here, and they might not have a good way of dealing with this. So get down my shadow. Now I get to start attacking, holding up counter magic. I will let the Boros Charm resolve because now I've got lethal next turn. Like, you have to stop me from killing you. So we'll attack. We'll go for fetching, and they have a deflecting palm, which I was not expecting at all out of this build. Like, I get that it's kind of burn oriented, but with the card choices I saw game one, deflecting palm didn't really like jump out at me as a possibility, but there we are nonetheless. On to match number 5. Good hand on the play. We've got Shadow, Murktide, Consider, Thoughtseize, some lands. Take away Ragavan. Leave Fury red card, which means, of course, opponent top deck's a scam effect. So we're probably going to have to take a hit off of this Fury, which is a little painful, but at the same time, we do have Shadow. And with this dress down, I should be able to like fight over something here. So this might have been a mistake. My opponent goes for the attack here, and my plan is like block the Fury and dress down just so I can like kill the Fury. There's a good chance that my opponent maybe has found another scam card, and if they have, then I could wait for them to cast that and then dress down, which would be better. But at the same time, if I wait too long, if they go for like first strike and then wait for the second strike damage and then cast their Undying Effect, I guess it would have been fine. So yeah, probably should have done that. But I just decided to block and dress down pre-damage, and my opponent lets the dress down resolve and then cast the Undying Effect. So it's like both slightly low chance that they would draw another Undying Effect, but still non-zero. But we do manage to untap and find a second Children's Edict, so didn't matter too terribly much. Spyro's, sometimes you just have that gut inclination, and when you do, you need to follow it. And my initial thought was, okay, I just dismember the Spyro, attack in for lethal. And then I was like, you know what? I just feel like my opponent has drawn a third Undying Effect off the top. I have that gut inclination. And my thought is, if I go for the Dismember, which would make this a lethal attack, and they've got the Undying Effect, I'm in so much worse of a position. Because even if they only get to make a token, like, they're just seeing so many more cards. But if I attack and they have it, I can Dismember in response. Or if they don't have it, I can just play out a second Shadow. Like, second Shadow Murktide. I'm not in a horrendous spot if I just play second Shadow Murktide. So I'm just going to be cautious. And sure enough, they had another Undying effect. So got that off the board. Straight into another Spyro, normal magic things. But now my opponent's empty handed. I've got this Murktide, top deck a counter spell. So all I've got to do is not die here. Counterspell would just hit anything from like Bolt to Terminate to whatever. Murktide being lethal in the air next turn means I don't have to worry about attacking. And on to game number 2. So sideboarding against Scam. Took out a bunch of Thoughtseize. I'm really, really low on Thoughtseize in the Scam matchup. For whatever reason, a bunch of people in chat are super high on it. I think it's better on the play than the draw, but I really don't think it's an effect that I'm like that interested in having to begin with. But I'll leave one in just to appease chat. Normally I wouldn't. Board out a couple copies of Murktide because of like Terminate and Scam Fury and what's it called? Unlicensed Hearse, all that kind of stuff. Murktide can be a bit of a liability. Boarding in one copy of Spreading Seas. It's not so much to like stop my opponent's mana as it is to help mine out in case of a Blood Moon. But you can like Spreading Seas your opponent off of basic swamps, say if they get a Blood Moon down. Turok's not bad to bring in. Drown and Lock kind of board out for the same reason as Murktide, just unlicensed Hearse. I'm bringing in unlicensed Hearse. Just want a little extra interaction that doesn't care so much about the graveyard. And what is my other board in? Spreading Seas, unlicensed Hearses. Something else. We'll see if we see it. Opening hands, fine. Like hoping for no Ragavan. Ironically, I think this is better for us than Ragavan, especially when we just top deck a Dismember. So get Grief off the board. Opponent does have the Ragavan, so we'll get down Shadow. Kind of hope that they don't have a way of killing the Shadow. Fatal Push, okay. We saw them miss their second land drop, so instead of playing out the Murktide, I'm just going to steal the Ragavan. We wait till they enter combat to do that, so that they can't dash a second Ragavan. But here we'll just get down our Murktide, kind of try to take advantage of them being shy on mana. And now I've got Subtlety to maybe hit like a big Evoke Elemental or something. Like so. Subtlety was one of the board ends that I forgot about. Subtlety and Dismember were a couple of the board ends because Dismember hits like the big Scam stuff. So my board ends against Scam were Dress Down, a Spreading Seas, Subtlety, Dismember, the Unlicensed Hearses. Yeah. So ended up that league 4-1. Solid league. Like, I wish I could go replay that artifact land capricious Hellraiser deck or whatever and see if some of my decisions mattered, like the countering the Spyro and getting down the second Shadow earlier. Because I think those could have had a significant part in that loss, but you never know. Ultimately, I did kind of miss the Street Wraiths, just a little more consistency at like getting Death Shadow online, especially against decks like Living End, where your life total's not in jeopardy. But we did see 3 mono red-ish decks with like lightning bolts and other burn spells. So Street Wraith could have been a very big liability. Shieldred's Edict was really good against Scam, really awkward against multiple token-based decks. So if you haven't read Shieldred's Edict, it's 1 in a black. Each opponent sacrifices a token creature, or each opponent sacrifices a non-token creature, or they sack a planeswalker. So you can specify, like, all right, if you got 3 goblin tokens out in a capricious Hellraiser, I can say, hey, sack a non-token creature, and you have to sack the Hellraiser. So it gets around like that normal edict restriction of just sack a creature. Um, but it's really awkward if your opponent is going wide, especially if it's off like Spyros and stuff like that, where the best thing you're going to get them to sack is a 2/2 body that you don't really care about to begin with. Um, the extra dress down in the main was okay. Brazen Borrower never came up. Minor Misstep. This is a card that I really, really dislike. And it's mostly because the matchups that you really want that effect for. And I recognize that Minor Misstep can hit like Ragavan and Dragon's Rage Channeler and stuff like that out of like Murktide or whatever. But I think the matchup you primarily want that slot for is like the Cascade Rhinos decks and Living End. And the fact that Misstep can get Force of Negation or Mystical Disputed, where Flusterstorm can't, is a huge, huge, huge drawback to Misstep to me. I don't think it's that necessary of a spot or card against like opposing Murktide decks, because you do just have a bunch of Archmage's Charms and counter spells and pushes, dismember, drown, whatever. So I think that spot's kind of wasted if your plan is to bring it in against Murktide. If you bring it in against Hammer, it's a little bit better, but at the same time, I think with like Dress Downs and Spreading Seas and Archmage's Charms and stuff like that, like the Hammer matchup's not terrible. So I don't know if it's really a matchup that you want to board in more stuff against. I personally think that like Rhinos is one of the big pain matchups. So I'm way more interested in playing Flusterstorm in that spot. But to each their own. Otherwise, Turok didn't really come up, but we didn't really see a lot of white based removal. Subtlety has been good the last couple times I've run it, so I'm probably interested in having like 2 subtlety. Spreading Seas is fine. Mystical Dispute's fine. Yeah. Somebody suggested Bitter Blossom in the Discord. That might be one that I'm interested in trying out a little bit more. But otherwise, this is the donation league. Hope everybody enjoyed it. I'll have some more videos up sometime, probably by the end of the afternoon. And yeah, hope you have an awesome rest of your day. Stay safe, enjoy some good food and company. Catch y'all back live later. Adios.